Hey you guys, welcome back to Reports on China. I'm Andy. Today I'll compare Western media reports on China's zero-tolerance Delta lockdowns and Western media reports on New Zealand's zero-tolerance Delta lockdowns before attempting to answer the fundamental question: why are Western media so unfair on China? Let's get reporting.
Hey, I'm Andy. I've always been obsessed with media. I started my own neighbourhood newspaper at 10 and my own TV channel at 15. At 19, I launched a national magazine that was available all over New Zealand. I worked for New Zealand politicians for a few years before our Prime Minister gave me a scholarship to come to China and study a master's degree in Chinese language and culture. I decided to stay, and now I'm a columnist and filmmaker in Shanghai. Come with me as I analyse how the world reports on China.
Both China and New Zealand have enforced strict lockdowns recently over the Delta variant of COVID-19, with New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern this week announcing the entire country would enter the highest level of lockdown following the discovery of a single case, the country's first in 6 months. But first, don't forget to hit like or leave a comment to help more people see this video, and follow Andy's Shanghai Life if you're outside mainland China. 如果你在中国大陆的话，请点个赞、写条评论和关注一下绿眼睛 Andy， 谢谢啊。New Zealand's level 4 lockdown means everyone must stay home and all businesses and schools must close their doors, apart from essential services. Anyone leaving home to perform urgent tasks must ensure 2 meters distance from others and wear masks at all times. This is almost exactly the same approach taken in many cities across China over the past few weeks, after Delta first appeared in the southern city of Nanjing and spread to dozens of other cities and provinces. So, can you guess which country's stance was labelled Draconian by Western media? Let's just say it wasn't New Zealand, but you already knew that. Western media have one English word they love to use a lot when speaking about China's response to COVID-19: draconian. Here are some quick recent examples. First up, The Hollywood Reporter, of all publications, pulled out the D word when speaking of the postponement of the Beijing International Film Festival. The Beijing International Film Festival, the Chinese government's flagship cinema event, has been postponed amid a resurgence in COVID-19 cases in the country, caused by the spread of the Delta variant, the article begins. Now, pretty much everyone on the entire planet knows that COVID-19, and especially the Delta variant, is easily passed on in crowded spaces, so postponing large-scale events sounds like a great idea. In fact, The Hollywood Reporter even admit that North America still contends with pandemic-era aversion to cinemas, which suggests that even Americans are avoiding cinemas over COVID fears. Why then do they see the need to pull out the D word as they end the article? Most cinemas across China remain in operation, the article ends, but the fresh outbreak and Beijing's draconian measures to contain it have many in the industry on edge over the potential for another broad shutdown. This should leave many scratching their heads, since the closure of large-scale events amid fresh outbreaks, in the eyes of the average person, is anything but draconian. But Western media have been given a free pass to use such loaded adjectives flippantly and at will. The Sydney Morning Herald's Stephen Bartholomew says, "The world is watching as China's Delta outbreak hits an already vulnerable economy." There has been a new wave of infections across China since last month's outbreak in Nanjing, he writes, which the authorities have responded to with lockdowns, travel restrictions, and limits on entertainment and large gatherings. Sounds pretty reasonable to me, but then he pulls out the D word. A number of conferences and other major events have been cancelled as the authorities roll out the draconian playbook they so successfully used to get last year's outbreak under control. Again, it seems like anything the Chinese government does, no matter how reasonable, is fundamentally draconian according to Western media. The Washington Post claimed that China's Delta outbreak is testing the limits of its zero-tolerance approach. Now, keep in mind that New Zealand also has a zero-tolerance approach, which basically means that both countries have decided their strategy is to have 0 cases and not to live with the virus, as the USA, UK and other nations have suggested. But as we'll see shortly, the treatment from Western media is blatantly contradictory when reporting on China. China's commitment to a zero-tolerance approach for coronavirus infections may be starting to fray, the article starts, before quoting a so-called expert who claims, there's a growing set of public health experts and policy scholars that's beginning to question the wisdom of the government's draconian approach. If they don't use the D word, Western media love to use other adjectives to describe China's action against COVID. The New York Times say that after months as a COVID success story, China tries to tame Delta, where they attack the country's zero-tolerance approach, despite its clear success. While the number of cases in China is still relatively low compared to the United States and elsewhere, the article says, these new outbreaks may undermine the ruling Communist Party's argument that its authoritarian style has been an unquestionable success in the pandemic. Interesting. CNN called China's response dramatic. China's worst coronavirus outbreak in a year has authorities taking dramatic measures to stamp out new infections, they say. Well, if you ask the average Chinese what's more dramatic, I'm sure they'd say it's the 623,000 deaths in the USA from COVID-19. Now let's take a look at Western media reports on New Zealand's national lockdown after a single case was discovered early this week. Let's start with CNN, who we saw just called China's lockdowns dramatic. In their article, New Zealand announces it's locking down the entire country over one COVID case. CNN have decided to err on the side of professional journalism and remain neutral by avoiding adjectives to describe the New Zealand government's measures in the first paragraph, where they say, New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has announced a nationwide lockdown after the country confirmed one coronavirus case. Perhaps completely unsurprisingly, there's no draconian or dramatic or authoritarian descriptors, and they even go on to applaud New Zealand's success so far. New Zealand has been praised for its handling of the virus, which saw it close borders to almost all foreign nationals early and impose strict state-run quarantines on incoming travellers. That approach has seen it avoid the devastating outbreaks seen in other countries, and prior to Tuesday's announcement, life in the country had largely returned to normal. Wow, that sounds exactly like the situation in China. Reuters called it a strict lockdown, mentioning that Prime Minister Ardern's strategy has helped curb COVID-19, before pointing out that under the level 4 lockdown, people must stay at home, leaving only for essential services. Protective face masks should be worn at all times when leaving home. Again, this is nearly exactly the same situation as some Chinese cities after cases of the Delta variant popped up in recent weeks. But there are absolutely zero instances of words like draconian, dramatic, or authoritarian when describing New Zealand locking down an entire country after one case was found in one city. The Washington Post, who called China's response draconian, albeit through a quote, mentioned New Zealand's situation before going on to call the country something of a pandemic star for its success in suppressing the virus. Now this is interesting because, again, New Zealand uses very similar methods as China, closed borders and strict government-run quarantine for those allowed to enter the country. So why are reports on China's response, despite being very similar to New Zealand's, so different? Well, I would argue it comes down to three things: cultural proximity, the fundamentally negative basis of Western mainstream media, and good old racism. I'll explain all of these briefly. First up, cultural proximity is the idea that certain nations share very similar cultures, ideals, and beliefs, right down to using the same language. Because Anglo nations speak English, place so-called democracy on a pedestal, and enjoy similar foods, it's easier to relate to others within the group. This allows for Anglo-Western media in New Zealand, Australia, the US, Canada, and the UK, despite often being separated by huge distances, to view countries within the group in a favourable light, even when they act in the same way as outside nations who are criticised for their actions. Case in point, New Zealand and Chinese responses to Delta outbreaks. On the flip side, people outside that group are often given different treatment, whether consciously or subconsciously. Next up, it's important to keep in mind the fundamentally negative basis of Western media. News media in the West is often referred to as the fourth estate, which basically means it's unofficially seen as a fundamental part of the political process, whose primary role is to hold the government to account by purposefully seeking out examples where governments or government officials have acted badly. This stretches all the way to public life, where all and any kind of bad news has become, in a way, the only thing that is newsworthy. Western readers, by and large, demand bad news from Western media, and one of the easiest ways to achieve that is to create an enemy, which leads to the last point, racism. Western media has the propensity to other cultures and peoples who are not part of the Anglo sphere, positioning them as somehow inferior and fundamentally inadequate, even when they act in basically the same way. This is especially evident when it comes to Asian peoples, whereby Western powers have historically seen the Eastern world as somehow primitive and inferior when measured against superior civilizations like the West. This has been referred to as Orientalism, and it's clearly alive and well in Western media and how they report on China, where everything has to have a negative spin, and every report, even those detailing positive stories from China, like the lifting of hundreds of millions from poverty, the way China has dealt with COVID-19, or China's massive efforts to preserve the environment, is twisted in order to paint China in a negative, or in the very least inferior light. The scary thing is that a lot of the process of othering groups of people, including Orientalism, is done subconsciously, which means that even many of the reporters writing such content may well be completely unaware of their own biases, and probably see their points of view on China as a matter of absolute fact. It's important to remember though, it's not just Western journalists doing this. It's also the consumers of Western media who demand conflict and bad news on a daily basis. China has become an easy and plentiful source of negative news for Western media to feed their hungry readers. So, what's the latest example you've seen of negative reporting on China? Let me know in the comments below. That's it for today. I will see you all next time.